Little John was making a garden outside, including many different flowers. He was so excited seeing all the flowers blooming, but then he came to the realization a key part of growth is eating, and he was not sure how plants had got food. That day, Little Johnny decided to do a bit of research, and he found a video explaining everything. And today we're going to talk about an incredible process that uses light and gas to make that we all love, sugar. And before we talk about the incredible process, photosynthesis, we have to identify which types of cells do perform this process. And only plant cells require photosynthesis and not animal cells. And knowing that, let's dive straight in. And first, let's go over the structure. The chloroplast has an inner and outer membrane with an empty space in between. Inside the chloroplasts are stacks of thylakoids called grana, as well as stroma, the dense fluid inside of a chloroplast. And these thylakoids contain the chlorophyll that is necessary for the plant to go through photosynthesis. Okay, so now you know about the structure of the mitochondria in the chloroplast. Let's talk about photosynthesis. Here's the formula for photosynthesis. On the left side of the formula, you'll find the reactants. That means these are the inputs. The plant has to have these in order to do photosynthesis. And on the right side of the formula, you'll find the products. That means those are the items that are produced by the plant. The outputs, the reactants, are 6CO2 plus 6H2O, and the products are C6H12O6 plus 6O2. There are two major reactions that occur in the chloroplast that together make up photosynthesis: the light-dependent reaction and the light-independent reaction. The light-independent reaction is also called the Calvin cycle. The light-dependent reaction happens in the thylakoids. In the light-dependent reaction, light is converted into chemical energy. By chemical energy, we mean ATP and NADPH. During the light-independent reaction, the reactants are sunlight and water, and the products are ATP, NADPH, and oxygen. But why make this ATP and NADPH? What do they do? Well, that's the next step, the light-independent reaction. The light-independent reaction also occurs in the chloroplast. In these items from the light-dependent reaction, so they can happen at the same time. While it still happens in the chloroplast, we never get out of the chloroplast with this. It does not happen in the thylakoid. Instead, it happens in the stroma. The stroma is fluid outside of the thylakoid. In this reaction, carbon dioxide must be fixed. And when I mean fixed, it means with the additional help of a major enzyme. The inorganic carbon dioxide is fixed to a more usable organic form. The ATP from the light-dependent reaction helps supply energy. The NADPH from the light-dependent reaction supplies reducing power. By that I mean it helps add high energy electrons to this process. So in a very complex series of pathways, the fixed carbon dioxide, ATP, and NADPH are used to make a product that ultimately can be converted into glucose. And together, the light-dependent cycle and the light-independent cycle, which happen simultaneously, create the glucose that plants need to survive. And this process of photosynthesis is necessary for plants to make sugar. And photosynthesis also supplies organisms with the oxygen they need, because remember, oxygen was also a product. After the video of photosynthesis, Little Johnny was so interested in these type of video and started watching all sorts of biological videos like cellular, respiration, and fermentation. And cells are very important to the body, and as they do, are constantly doing work. Therefore, they need energy. They make energy by going through the process of cellular respiration, and only eukaryotic cells go through this process, so that involves both animal and plant cells. And it takes place in the mitochondria. Mitochondria are shaped perfectly to maximize their productivity. They're made of two membranes. The outer membrane covers the organelle and contains it like skin. The inner membrane folds over many times and creates layered structures called cristae. The first step is glycolysis, and this step takes place inside the plasm, and this step does not require oxygen, and we call this anaerobic since there is no presence of oxygen. And glucose, the sugar from the formula, is converted into a more usable called pyruvate. And it actually takes a little ATP energy itself to get this process started. The net yield from this step is simultaneously 2 ATP molecules and 2 NADH molecules. What is NADH? NADH is a coenzyme, and it has the ability to transfer electrons, and which will be very useful in making even more ATP later on, and we'll get to that in a minute. The second step is the Krebs cycle, and this is also called the critic acid cycle, and happens in the mitochondrial matrix. We're not involved in the mitochondria, and this step requires oxygen. The pyruvate that was made is converted and will be oxidized. CO2 is produced, and you produce 2 ATP, 6 NADH, and 2 FADH2. FADH is also a coenzyme like NADH, and will also assist in transferring electrons to make even more ATP. The last step is electron transport chain. This is just a very beautiful thing. We're in this mitochondria, and we do require oxygen for this step. This is a very complicated process, and you're really simplifying by saying that NADH and FADH2 are the electron carriers, and they send an electron through the chain, and they're used to create a proton gradient. The protons are used to power an amazing enzyme called ATP synthase. And remember that synthesis means to make, so that's what ATP synthase does. All the time, it makes the ATP by adding phosphates to ADP, and the oxygen is the final receptor of the electrons. When oxygen combines with 2 protons, you get H2 or aka water. The electron transport chain produces a lot of ATP compared to the other 2 steps. And there's an exact number on this, however, many believe that there's 34 ATP, meaning that the overall amount of ATP made when you add all the steps together is 38 ATP, but that is only if everything runs perfectly, and in general, you can expect a lot less ATP made. Fermentation is a way to able to handle the little to no oxygen issue. It allows for glycolysis to happen and for glycolysis to keep going. That means making ATP when there is no oxygen. Alcoholic fermentation is done by some types of yeast. The first glycolysis, which yields 2 net ATP, 2 pyruvates, and 2 NADH. Now in this step to regenerate to NAD+, so we can keep doing glycolysis. The 2 pyruvates are used, which will ultimately produce carbon dioxide and 2 ethanol. But the derivative of pyruvate shown here, acetaldehyde, can act as an electron receptor in this process, so that 2 NADH can be oxidized to 2 NAD+, so the glycolysis can start all over. And since ethanol is a waste product in this process, yeasts also can do alcoholic fermentation making bread. And the carbon dioxide product we mentioned is involved with helping with the bread rise. The tiny amount of alcohol produced in the short fermenting time of bread will evaporate in the making process. Now we will talk about the lactic acid fermentation, as can be done by cells such as your muscle cells. For example, while muscle cells can do aerobic cellular respiration, they can shift to lactic acid fermentation if they experience an oxygen debt. And this could happen if you're working out very intensely where your blood is unable to deliver sufficient amount of oxygen to them for their demand. And just like the alcoholic fermentation, we start with the glycolysis that yields 2 net ATP, 2 pyruvates, 2 NADH. But now we need to step to regenerate to NAD+, and this step is a bit different from alcoholic fermentation. Due to pyruvates on the reactant side will ultimately yield to lactate. The pyruvate can act as an electron receptor, allowing NADH to be oxidized to NAD+, so the glycolysis can start over. From all these videos, little Johnny had been enriched by all this fascinating biological information. He learned how plants made food and how to get energy with and without oxygen all in one day. And most importantly, now he knows how to keep his garden in good condition due to all the new facts he learned about photosynthesis.